Thanks, guys. And thank you to the Creative Mornings team. It's really nice to be back here again. And it's really lovely to be able to do this talk at the Union Theatre in Helsinki during our Viva Erotica Festival. So the reason I'm here today is because of my dear friend, Emilia Mikola, who looked me up a few years ago to tell me that she and the film critic, Olaf Möller, were starting a porn film festival called Viva Erotica, which she described as a splendid movie orgy. And so it looks into the history of art and sex on film. And when she was saying film, she really meant film. Original format, Super 8 and 35 millimeter films. This is a festival that's curated by cinephiles for cinephiles. So as you know, the festival takes place here in Helsinki every May. We're in our third year. And though Emilia and I had got in touch, though Emilia and I hadn't been in touch for a while, she looked me up because she had been following my work and thought maybe I should, come along. So my work. Nowadays, I'm a writer and a literary translator, and my work looks a lot like this. And when I'm not translating Swedish language books into English, I'm writing about sex, power, and sort of bridging fantasy and reality. But once upon a time, I used to work with pornography as an editor at a business-to-business company, kind of like Variety, which reports on the film industry, or Billboard, which reports on the music industry. We were reporting on the adult entertainment industry. So that was called Adult Video News, or AVN. They call themselves the most respected name in the least respected industry. I was there for a while, and eventually I wanted a new challenge. I wanted to work with a different kind of story. For me, it was a really intuitive leap to move from one kind of storytelling, business to business, to another. I now work with literature. But I had this anxiety. The transition made me really nervous, and it's kind of nerves that I feel every time I talk about pornography to this day. I had this anxiety when I was preparing this talk. I realized that I'm afraid of being judged, and that none of you will actually be listening to me because this footnote in my biography sort of invalidates anything that I have to say. Mostly in my life, I'm surrounded by like-minded people, and however, there are far too many reminders that our society isn't really like my bubble. Recently, I read another one of those articles where a guy with a decent job who used to work in the porn industry gets fired because his employers found out about his past. This person, all he had done was have he was like a background extra in a porn movie where he was fully clothed, engaged in no sex. It was just a walk-on part, but his employers found out, and like so many people who have worked in the porn industry, most usually performers, it can hamper their career development. It kind of follows you. But this moment in porn was a deal breaker for this guy's employer, and he was fired. I thought, it feels like a real vintage deal breaker, something that really shouldn't have a place in our society today, where we have so much of our private life is available for public consumption. We know that anything you can think up, whether it's about sex or ballooning around the Arctic, somebody is probably doing it, and you can probably watch them doing it online. But yet let's think of this man who lost his job because he had been an extra on a porn set. I wanted to share this picture with you. This is an image by Jo Brofton. She's a lovely photographer from London, and she did this great series of empty porn sets. Anyway, so for some people, porn is still taboo. It's representative of social evils and moral decay. It's something to be kept hidden or enjoyed in secret, not in dialogue like we're doing today. So when porn is treated as taboo, I think we're prevented from having a decent conversation about it. When I talk about porn, I notice a few things happening. I lower my eyes. I can feel my ears are red. And I start making apologies. I feel really nervous. I expect to have to explain myself or find out that because of this part of my biography, your image of me will have arrived fully formed, and it won't be good. I remember going out in LA when I was working at AVN and seeing how people's eyes would change when I told them where I worked. these sort of assumptions would appear and judgment, even among the most liberal, seemingly cool people. Everybody kind of thinks you're easy or up for it, or they can make like terrible, terrible jokes about sex to you that are actually quite offensive, and you're just supposed to like it because you're close in some way to this material. So even though I've now been working with the subject of sex in various capacities for about a decade now, I still have this hard time talking about it, because I think I'm still knocking up against the idea that it's a little taboo. And when something is taboo, there's a lot of baggage to contend with before we can start asking the really interesting questions. A taboo is, in the way we're talking about it today, it's a hurdle, an apprehension, and something that keeps us from communicating honestly and openly. And it can lead to us censoring ourselves. So I started to wonder what other people's taboos are, the things that keep them from asking the really good questions, that lead to like really good writing or fantastic ideas or just empathy and the ability to connect in a meaningful way with friends or colleagues or clients. So I looked to literature. This is Claire Vaye Watkins. She's one of my absolute favorite writers. And she tells this story about not allowing herself to make art out of her experiences after she became a mother. I'm going to read you a little quote from this essay called On Pandering. She writes, "I have not written anything of consequence since my daughter was born. Why would that be? I think it has something to do with the fact that I don't wander in the desert much anymore. I spend my days with a baby, and that, the patriarchy says, is not the stuff of art. Once again, I am a girl and not a writer. No one said this. No one has to. I'm saying it to myself." This is the book she wrote after she had that realization, by the way. It's great. But here it is. Here is a personal taboo. Or I guess we could also call it an unconsciously held belief that she had yet to discover and therefore she had yet to challenge. But why is it there? How is it creative? And how can we move through it? I think the answer has something to do with permission. In 2013, I went to Kenya to do a series of sort of publicity and writing workshops with a group of emerging writers from across Africa. One day we were talking about how they all started to write. And one writer said he'd always wanted to write, but he didn't know his story was worth writing down until he read Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Until he read her, he didn't realize that he was allowed to make art about his experience. There was an assumption about art that he had consciously or subconsciously ascribed to, and he didn't know how to challenge it, and he didn't know to challenge it until he became aware that it existed by reading, until he found himself in dialogue with the text. He said that Adichie's novels gave him the permission to write. This experience of permission reminded me of something that Richard Rorty wrote about how we're given language by the world, how we're given language not by the world, but by other people. Rorty writes, "The world does not speak, only we do. The world can, once we have programmed ourselves with a language, cause us to hold beliefs, but it cannot propose a language for us to speak. Only other human beings can do that." So I would say that other human beings can also mean a text, a work of art, or a porn film. Like Michael Pataki's Cinderella, which will be showing on Saturday. I hope you guys can come. So through other human beings and other texts, these two writers I mentioned above were made aware of unconsciously held beliefs, and then they gave themselves the permission to challenge them. They both described a kind of aha moment, a moment when their relationship to their art changed, and they found a new spring of creativity. One could also say that they gave themselves permission to create shamelessly. So when we think about taboo as we're talking about it today, as a blockage or something that makes you nervous or makes you stutter, a topic wrapped in shame and apprehension, I wonder what stores of creativity, insight, and knowledge can be unlocked if you give yourself permission to be shameless? What happens if you lean into something that makes you feel really uneasy, whether that's sort of ecstasy or sadness or joy? Which brings us back around to Viva Erotica. This is Emilia and Olof, and then there's the wonderful Dali Kuhn, who often brings us fantastic, rare material from her archive at the Werkstattkino. So at Viva Erotica, we screen documentaries, golden age pornos, and rare gems that Emilia and Olof, by some magic and a lot of hard work, seeking out collections, film collectors and archives, pulled together. We also screen non-pornographic films where sex is the central subject. And this is us testing out a projector in the first year. Here's Mano Destra, wonderful, wonderful, rare SM film that we screened last year. We've also looked at Censorship Law in Denmark and Bavarian sex comedies and Russ Meyer. So to us, it's an event that gives people the space to engage deeply with the idea of fantasy and the erotic and the art of representing sex, and indeed to have conversations about it. In the media coverage, we've been able to talk about these topics in a way that suggests an openness to our view of the erotic and why a festival like this is important today. But we also keep getting this other question, and it's often from audience members, and they're wondering, will people be masturbating in the cinema? So this question, it made me rethink what we were doing. So beyond illuminating an overlooked corner of film history, what were we offering to the audience by asking them to look at porn as part of and not separate from popular culture and the art of cinema? I mean, nowadays, consuming porn is a largely solitary endeavor, so, I mean, what were we all going to be doing in the dark together? So watching porn as a communal activity used to be something we did out of necessity. A friend who grew up in the 80s remembers taking these summer holidays to the south of Italy, where as soon as all the parents would be out of the house, his male cousins would all gather downstairs and put on a porno, and then they'd start furiously masturbating together, but you were supposed to really pretend that the other people weren't there. You know, we created these spaces. We had to find them. Like, here's an image from a Radley Metzger film called The Licorice Quartet, which is about a group of people who hole up in a villa, also in Italy, to watch stag films. So, you know, going back further before, speaking of stag films, let me show you that slide. So going back further, like before home video systems, someone would get their hands on stag films and you'd screen them at home or anywhere you might find some privacy. And, you know, during the golden age of porn in the 1970s, when movies like Deep Throat were being shown at movie theaters across the US, there was something special that happened. There was this moment where porn became really chic. And you could say a sort of upper middle class interest developed. You know, you had like Martin Scorsese and Frank Sinatra and Truman Capote speaking in public about watching and enjoying Deep Throat. I want to add a little caveat that, you know, Linda Lovelace, the film star, had a really complicated relationship to her career and levied allegations of abuse against some of the people that she worked with. And I really believe that such matters absolutely must be taken seriously. But I think we also, but this is also a moment where we're just trying to recall a time when a conversation about porn had sort of begun to make its way out of the shadows. And perhaps make space for a more nuanced conversation about the issues that Linda Lovelace, you know, had raised in her lifetime. So in a study by Dr. Susanna Passanen, who's also joining us during the festival on Sunday, she did this wonderful study on Finnish porn consumption. I really liked this anecdote. It's about these two kids who want to go get some porn. And so they're saving up gas money, they're identifying a shop in the next village over that sells some dirty magazines. They're jumping on mopeds, and the mopeds have like broken headlights, and charging their way through heavy snow in order to, you know, get their hands on some salacious content. It was a real mission, you know, and like the title of Dr. Passanen's study, We Hid Porn Magazines in the Woods, sort of the practice of friends stashing porn in the woods or coming across these like porn libraries, shall we say, like hidden in rural spaces or hidden in in-between spaces. It was a common way that people of, you know, a certain generation remember discovering and accessing porn. I mean, I grew up in the 80s on the California coast, and there's this like, if you climb down the cliffs, there's a cave around the sort of edge of the bay that I grew up on, and for some reason it would always be like littered with porn magazines. I was assuming it was, you know, today I'm like, okay, it was probably people illegally fishing abalone, waiting while they were fishing, setting up fires, and I guess maybe also to enjoy themselves a little bit more than the beer cans I also found when I was a small child. So when we think about these days, I think there's a sort of discrete social element to porn. You had to know where to get it, you had to create a network of sharing, and you had to find a safe space to to consume it in. So because of the conditions needed for watching a porn film, space and discretion, you might have to share the experience. And however covert, this was a social process of discovering. So nowadays, I think most of us consume our porn all by ourselves, you know, with the rare exception of a festival like this, or Cinekink in the States, or the Porn Film Fest in Berlin. You know, places that ask their audience to consider the art of the sex film and not just its utility. So what does this solitary, antisocial experience mean for our fantasy lives? I think how we consume porn has changed our relationship to it. And because of its ubiquity, it's much easier to treat it purely as a tool, a trigger, and not much more. And as triggers, I don't think we really, if you're just going to something as a trigger, I think it doesn't really have to be of a particularly good quality. I think you just need a provocative framework that kind of does it for you. And I'm just talking from personal experience because I like some terrible stuff that as art is just no good at all, but it's the right framework and it pulls the right triggers. Anyway, so I think in spite of porn's ubiquity, I think we really have a problem of discovery. Oh, look at him finding his porn this is a short film about a kid who finds a secret stash of porn. So anyway, let's imagine walking into a bookshop and you're looking for something to read, but all you know about books is there's like one called 50 Shades of Grey, and then there's this other one called Harry Potter. So how do you navigate this space and find things that will like blow your mind? How do you discover your love of the psychological thriller or find that author whose work is just going to change your life? Like if you're really lucky, one of those incredible booksellers will sort of appear and sort of cold read you and offer you a text that, you know, really nails it and changes you and moves you. You know, that we don't necessarily, like, do we have these guides in pornography? I think if you're sort of left to just sift through the stacks, I think it requires like a real willingness and it requires time and effort. And I think that kind of inquiry doesn't really come natural to many of us, especially with a subject that we might not have an active and social interest in. You know, it's probably easier to get book recommendations and to really explore that deeply because there's an entire, you know, articulated, established, not taboo culture of, you know, books pages in the newspaper and whatnot. So I thought about this metaphor partially because I've moved from pornography into books, but I also remember thinking, how am I going to navigate all this porn that I'm supposed to be reviewing at Adult Video News? There was this closet that, I mean, it was smaller than this, but there was a warehouse that was about this size. And I was like, it's just boxes. They could really contain anything. Like, what am I going to find? I had a really great boss, and she took me into the company's warehouse, so where all the DVDs that they got were stored. And she started like pulling DVDs off the shelves and telling me what they were about and which of my colleagues like preferred Girls in Stockings and which ones really liked gangbangs, or alt, which was sort of like, I guess like a hipster strain of porn that came up in the early 2000s. It felt really kind of revolutionary then because it was introducing like a very new, or like an updated aesthetic, like away from the sort of hair and tits of the 80s. Anyway, so with so much exposure to porn, we were reviewing about 300 movies a month. And we were also managing, as you saw in the earlier poster, the sort of Oscars of porn, a big porn award ceremony. I started to develop a taste for what I like, a kind of critical appreciation that helps me navigate a seemingly endless supply of erotic content. So, I started noticing things like, that performer looks like she'd rather be elsewhere, or that's what pleasure looks like in performance, and that's what a truly authentic sex performance means. But I wonder often, what if you don't have a guide? What if you don't have the time or inclination to develop preferences for porn, but are still hoping for something that will bend your mind or expand the vocabulary of your fantasy life? What if this is an experience that you don't even know you want, and yet it might change your life? This is a shot of the AVN Awards that I unceremoniously skipped over. So I think this question of discovery is one of the most compelling arguments for Viva Erotica. It also touches on this idea of permission and shamelessness. At Viva Erotica, as with a book, you're able to engage with a story, an aesthetic, a life in a risk-free way. You can sort of live yourself into the text and feel what it's like to be inside this world. In the text, it will suggest a way of being or interacting, and it might introduce you to a new mode or a new way of thinking. It might even introduce you to a fantasy that you kind of never knew you wanted to have. So what about the people who asked if there would be masturbating in this cinema? I was wondering what were they actually asking? What was it that they were worried about? So let's break it down. We go to the cinema in order to sit in silence. We agree that we're going to disengage socially while the film is on, and then we're going to probably reconvene and talk about the movie afterwards. So unless we burst out laughing, like in a comedy, or burst into tears, or shudder with fear, or have some other physical response, what's going on inside our heads is just for us. It's private. It's part of a private sphere of our fantasy lives. And perhaps we'll share it with those lucky few who we feel comfortable to be that intimate with. The question about whether or not people will be masturbating in the cinema suggests, in a way, a fear about what will happen if this private information about the self is shared with the group. It kind of goes against codes of social conduct in a public space, yes, but to masturbate in the cinema would also mean that to acknowledge, this right here, it's turning me on. And I think that can really freak people out, even the person who might be masturbating in the cinema. I took this question to a friend of mine who works at this beautiful queer vegan sex shop called Other Nature in Berlin. Kitty May is a sex educator, and she runs these wonderful intimacy workshops, also workshops about erotic communication and sexuality. So she was telling me that even when the groups she works with feel really cool, the groups, it feels like a safe space, everybody's communicating really openly, she often does this exercise where she asks people to write their fantasies down on a piece of paper. So imagine a chatty, happy group that's really excited to be talking about what they're talking about with other people and learning all this stuff about themselves. They freeze. They do not want to write their fantasies down on paper. And she says this happens every time. She has to assure them and reassure them that they will never, never, never have to share these fantasies. It's just an exercise in articulating what you want. And she says it really strikes her. It happens every single time. And she thinks of all the things that they can and will talk about. Their fantasy lives are so private. Sharing that fantasy, it feels like a taboo. We wonder, why is this? Are we afraid of rejection? Are we afraid of being judged? Do we not like what we think our fantasies are saying about us? I think this feeling of taboo, it creates a shame and an anxiety. And, I'm not above that. I also feel this when I talk about this subject. So as I sat here in the cinema that first year at Viva Erotica, I realized that this was the first time that I'd ever really watched porn as art, not judging it on its merits for a porn awards show, not thinking about it as a masturbatory aid. I watched these films as films. And sort of through the sheer force of repetition, because watching 6 to 8 hours of erotic content a day kind of puts you into a bit of a sort of trance state, like giving yourself over to the logic and rhythm of an extended DJ set. So I was in this really like receptive space, and I found myself in a sort of dialogue with my desires and my fantasy life in a way that I hadn't been before. By watching these sex films as films and being open to whatever was coming my way, I ended up in dialogue with these texts, and I was conducting a kind of intimate research. So while watching documentaries, feature films, and hardcore pornography, I realized what a privilege it is to gaze at naked bodies. I mean, really, really stare. There are not a lot of spaces where we're allowed to just revel in the sight of someone else. You know, when else do you get to consider the sort of shapes and textures of other people? You know, I noticed that I took a liking to, like I finally understood a colleague who was super, super into something that he described as puffy nipples. I had never really understood what he meant until one of the films that we screened. You know, and sometimes I was surprised by what I found beautiful and what I found sexy, a spread of hair or a certain kind of curve, or even an emotion being conveyed on screen. I also paid attention to like which sex acts and types of kissing and types of touch were turning me off or on. So, and then sometimes my disgust kicked in, and I thought this was kind of unexpected, that I cannot stand the idea of pairing sex with food. But this sort of questioning of self, this like intimate research, it didn't stop there. By creating this space where I could sit and pay attention to the shape of my desire, being in dialogue with these films, I started to wonder about the rest of my fantasy life. Like, what could my fantasies tell me about myself? I'm going to give you an example. When I was at AVN, I found out that I really liked watching gangbangs. I can't imagine a real-life situation in which I'd want to participate, but for sort of, let's say, a decade, they've been one of my go-to scenarios in porn watching. I've never been particularly comfortable with this fantasy. I have so many questions, you know, logistics and how things all fit together, and, you know, I don't know, it seems like such a knotted kind of jumble. And sometimes it really does seem like more sport than pleasure. My like discomfort with this being one of my top things to think about was only mildly allayed by a friend who used to run a porn streaming service, and back before so much internet porn was free. He was saying that almost all of the majority of people who watched gangbangs were people who had at least identified as women through their credit card information. So after my experience at Viva Erotica, I decided to pay attention to what this fantasy was doing with me and what I was doing with it. I realized that my interest in the gangbang scenario had shifted and changed over the years. Sometimes I was really tickled by the idea of like all this energy and shared lust being in the same room. There were, you know, long stretches where I was really fascinated by the limits of the body. And when gangbangs first caught my attention, there was something about the idea of submission that really enticed me. You know, and when I think about the challenges I was having in my life at the time, I think it really makes perfect sense to me. It really helped me understand why I was so willing to endure these challenges. So recently, the thing that really gets me off about this fantasy is a kind of like imagined divine feminine fertility goddess thing. The scenario takes shape in my mind like a fertility rite. Like, imagine a woman inspiring so much lust in men that they just can't help but spill their seed. This kind of iteration of the fantasy coincided with my first serious thoughts about motherhood. And I thought that made a sort of interesting kind of sense. So, in addition to the provocative framework, the trigger, I now look at this fantasy as a way for me to sort of take my temperature. How I fantasize tells me about how I'm feeling about myself and how I feel in the world at any given point. And I think this kind of inquiry sits alongside things like dream interpretation or psychoanalysis, you know, places where you go in your life to discover these things, to discover new things about yourself. You know, and I find that in my own fiction writing, the more I pay attention to my erotic fantasies, you know, who features in them, the power dynamics in play, and so on, the more sensitive I am to why I write what I'm writing. And this certainly does not exclusively apply to when I'm writing about the topic of sex, but also how I'm writing and thinking about people and the dynamics of relationships in the world. So I would argue that we have to allow our erotic desire to become an integral part of the body of stories we tell about ourselves, or else I think we're at risk of losing out on really interesting personal insights and sources of inspiration. You know, our taboos, they mediate the access we have to ourselves, and so in order to understand ourselves, we really have to learn to understand them. So by investigating our taboos rather than turning away from them, we might find keys to parts of ourselves that we didn't know were locked. We don't have to fling the doors open, but it's good to know what's inside. And at Viva Erotica, our audience may not be masturbating in the cinema, but they're hopefully finding themselves in dialogue and discovering keys that unlock the possibility of being shameless and being free. Thank you.